I thought we'd start the show by having a no-holds-barred look at this rising prosperity we keep hearing about. If this is genuine, shouldn't we be able to provide minimum wage workers the same purchasing power they enjoyed 50 years ago in 1970? It's really a very simple proposition. Either the country can provide minimum wage workers the same purchasing power they enjoyed 50 years ago, or it can't. If it can't, all the claims about rising prosperity are obviously false. Or is there something I haven't understood? Let's keep this simple and have a look at the basic minimum wage, not the net wage, and compare the situation in 1970 with that of today. Lower the rate of consumer price inflation arbitrarily. In the real world, wage earners bought whatever cars and houses were available at the time and rented whatever apartments were available at the time. The only accurate way to measure and compare the purchasing power of labour is to ask how many hours of minimum wage labour it required to pay the rent, buy a new car, or buy a new house. Any other measure is just sleight of hand intended to obscure the collapse of wages' purchasing power. In 1970, you earned $1.65 an hour. A new economy car, a Ford Maverick or Volkswagen Beetle, was $2,000. So it took about $1,200 hours of work to buy a new economy car. A new house cost on average about $26,000 in 1970. So it took 15,750 hours of minimum wage labour to buy a new house. At today's federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, it takes 3,000 hours to buy a basic 2021 Honda Civic or equivalent, which costs $22,000. To buy a new economy car today with 1,200 hours of minimum wage labour, the minimum wage would need to be $18.30 an hour. 1,200 times $18.30 is 26,000 hours to buy the average priced house, which now costs $408,000. Let's say there are houses available for $300,000. So it takes 41,380 hours of minimum wage labour to buy a house. To buy a new house for $408,000, with 15,750 hours of labour, the wage would need to be $25.90 an hour. To buy a $300,000 home with 15,750 hours of labour, the wage would need to be $19 an hour. Moving forwards a few years to 1974, the minimum wage increased. To buy a $300,000 home with 15,750 hours of labour, the wage would need to be $19 an hour. Moving forwards a few years to 1974, the minimum wage increased to $2 an hour, and you could have rented a small studio apartment in Honolulu, one of the most expensive cities in the US, for $120 a month. Thus, it took 60 hours of minimum wage labour to pay the rent. Studio apartments in Honolulu are now around $1,100 a month to rent, so to pay the rent with 60 hours of minimum wage labour, the minimum wage would need to be $18.30 an hour. In 1970, to attend the University of Hawaii at Manoa. These numbers stick in your head when you're paying for them in cash earned at low-paying jobs while you're carrying a full 5 courses a semester. That's $233 a year. At a wage of $2 an hour, it'll take 116 hours of labour to pay the annual tuition and fees in 1974. The current cost of tuition and fees at the University of Hawaii at Manoa is $12,186 a year. To pay the tuition and fees with 116 hours of work, the hourly wage would need to be $105 an hour. If America gets any more prosperous, I won't know whether to puke or go blind. To equal the purchasing power of minimum wages in 1970 to 1974, the minimum wage would have to be at least $18 an hour. Anything less fails to equal the purchasing power of the minimum wage paid 50 years ago, and no amount of statistical trickery can erase this reality. What does it say about America's so-called prosperity if the country can't even afford to equal the purchasing power of the minimum wage paid 50 years ago? It says the 1% got the mine and the bottom 90% got the shaft. You can just walk outside and watch it happen right in front of you. Before 2020, social decay was steadily eating away at society, but once the pandemic hit, many societal problems greatly accelerated. Even while the Federal Reserve was ensuring that wealthy Wall Street investors were being taken care of well, poverty and homelessness were exploding in major cities all over the nation. Meanwhile, an increasing number of people have been turning to drugs to cope with their problems, which has particularly been true in the urban areas. When I lived in New York, Washington Square Park in Lower Manhattan was quite lovely, but now it's being described as lawless and drug-infested because of the hordes of drug addicts that constantly hang out there. A lawless, drug-infested lovely, but now it's being described as lawless and drug-infested because of the hordes of drug addicts that constantly hang out there. A lawless, drug-infested Washington Square Park is horrifying, even among famously free-spirited Greenwich Village residents. Stephen Hill has called the neighbourhood home since 1980. He lamented, quote-unquote, "We may be liberal, but this has gone too far. There have always been drugs in the park, mostly pot. But what's emerged this spring is like nothing we've ever seen before." Just like so many other public spaces in major cities across the country, Washington Square Park is no longer a safe place for families. These days, local residents are kept awake until the wee hour night around the central fountain. Washington Square Park's northwest corner was overtaken in recent months by a crack and heroin-filled drug den, while boisterous, booze-soaked raves around the central fountain have kept neighbours up until the wee hours and left the historic green space trashed each morning. Of course, this sort of activity can be found all over New York City these days, but I have a soft spot for Washington Square Park. In fact, at this point, even Times Square has been virtually taken over by drug addicts and homeless people. Andy Hort runs a printing company in Times Square. He said he now avoids the area whenever he can. Quote, "There's a lot more crime and a lot more drug addicts and vagrants everywhere. In the last 3 months, I've seen 3 or 4 people shooting up right in front of me. 4 people shooting up right in front of me." End of quote. If you started seeing people regularly do heroin right in front of you, you'd probably move. That's what hundreds of thousands of New York residents have done. But even though so many people have moved out, crime rates in the Big Apple just continue to rise. The days when New York City was one of America's safest major cities seem so far away now. According to the latest NYPD data, crime in the city is up 30% so far.